The room is called the cockpit. It's a cramped, amphitheater-style chamber in the heart of the British government, and the air is stiflingly hot. Packed into the viewing gallery are 35 members of the Privy Council, the most powerful men in the British Empire. Crowding the edges are spectators, including the famous philosopher Edmund Burke. They have all come to see a blood sport. But they aren't watching roosters fight. They are watching the systematic destruction of an old man. Standing in the center of the pit, motionless, is a 68-year-old colonial agent. He is wearing a suit of spotted Manchester velvet. He doesn't have a wig on, which, in this company, is almost an act of nudity. He stands like a statue while Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General of Great Britain, screams at him. For an hour, Wedderburn unleashes a torrent of abuse. He calls the old man a thief, a liar, a conspirator, and a traitor. He accuses him of trying to destroy the relationship between the colonies and the crown. The lords of the council laugh. They jeer. They pound the tables in delight. It is a public execution of character. The old man doesn't blink. He doesn't speak. He doesn't wipe the sweat from his forehead. He just stares straight ahead, his face a mask of stone, but inside, a fuse has been lit. The man standing in that pit is Benjamin Franklin. And up until this very moment, he has been the greatest champion of the British Empire in America. He loved the king. He loved the culture. He spent years trying to hold the two sides together. But as the laughter rains down on him in the cockpit, Benjamin Franklin decides that the empire is not a mother to be obeyed, but a monster to be slain. He walked into that room a proud Briton. He would walk out the first American. This is the story of how a runaway apprentice, a media mogul, a scientist who stole fire from the gods, and a reluctant revolutionary became the mastermind behind the United States. To understand how Franklin ended up in that pit of vipers, we have to go back, way back. Not to the marble statues and the $100 bills, but to a crowded, smelly candle shop in Boston, 1706. Benjamin was the 15th of 17 children. 17. Just let that sink in. In a house that crowded, you have to be loud to be heard, or you have to be clever. Ben was both. His father, Josiah, was a candle and soap maker. It sounds quaint, but in the 18th century, making soap meant boiling animal fat. It smelled like death. Ben hated it. He hated the smell, the grime, the monotony. He stood over those boiling vats of grease, dreaming of the sea. He wanted to be a sailor. He wanted to see the world. His father, terrified his youngest son would run off to sea and drown, looked for a different way to harness the boy's obvious intelligence. He tried to make him a minister, but Ben was too skeptical. He tried to make him a cutler, but the apprenticeship fee was too high. Finally, at age 12, Ben was signed over to his older brother, James. James was a printer. He ran the New England Courant, one of the first independent newspapers in the colonies. This was the internet of the 1720s. It was where ideas happened. And Ben took to it immediately. He learned to set type, to work the press, to mix ink. But more importantly, he read. He read everything he could get his hands on. He would skip meals to buy books. He taught himself to write by rewriting essays from The Spectator, trying to improve the flow and the logic. But there was a problem. James Franklin was not a nice boss. He was jealous, controlling, and frequently violent. He beat Ben. He treated him like a slave, not a brother. And he certainly didn't want his kid brother writing for his paper. So Ben got creative. One morning, James found a letter slid under the door of the print shop. It was signed by a widow named Silence Doggood. The letter was funny, biting, and incredibly sharp. It poked fun at the stuffy Boston elites and the hypocrisy of the Puritans. James loved it. He published it. The town went wild. Everyone wanted to know, who is this brilliant widow? Ben wrote 14 of these letters. He was 16 years old, posing as a middle-aged woman, and he was the toast of Boston. He was trolling the entire city, and nobody knew it. When Ben finally revealed the secret, expecting a pat on the back, James was furious. The jealousy boiled over. The beatings got worse. Ben realized he had two choices: stay and be crushed, or break the law and run. In 1723, running away from an apprenticeship was illegal. It was a breach of contract. Fugitive notices would be posted, but Ben didn't care. He sold his books for cash, snuck onto a sloop, and fled. He went first to New York, found no work, and kept going south. Picture this: the future founding father, 17 years old, disheveled, dirty, pockets stuffed with spare shirts and socks, stumbling off a boat in Philadelphia. He's hungry. He buys 3 great puffy rolls of bread. He has no pockets big enough, so he tucks 1 roll under each arm and eats the 3rd as he walks up Market Street. A girl named Deborah Reed is standing in her doorway. She sees this goofy, messy teenager marching past, bread in his armpits, and she laughs. She thinks he looks ridiculous. 7 years later, she'd marry him. But first, Franklin had to conquer the city. Philadelphia in the 1720s was a boomtown. It was tolerant, chaotic, and full of opportunity. Franklin landed a job as a printer, and his talent was undeniable. He was faster, smarter, and stronger than anyone else, but he was also young and naive. The governor of Pennsylvania, a man named William Keith, took a shine to Ben. He promised to set Ben up with his own shop. He told Ben to go to London to buy equipment, promising that letters of credit would be waiting for him on the ship. Ben, starstruck, sailed to London. He arrived, reached for the letters of credit, and nothing. The governor had lied. It was a prank. A cruel, power-playing prank. Ben was stranded in London, the biggest, dirtiest city in the world, with no money and no friends. Most teenagers would have crumbled. Ben Franklin thrived. He got a job at a massive printing house. He worked alongside hard-drinking Londoners who chugged beer for breakfast. They called him the Water American because he only drank water, yet he could carry the heavy forms of lead type up the stairs when they could only carry one. He learned the latest techniques. He scrutinized the British political system. He swam in the Thames. He sowed his wild oats, and we're not going to be coy about this. Franklin liked the ladies, and the ladies liked him. After 2 years, he returned to Philadelphia. He was done being a victim. He was done being an employee. He was ready to take over. He set up his own shop. He bought a failing newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and turned it into the most widely read paper in the colonies. How? By inventing modern journalism. He printed maps. He printed sensational crime stories. He printed gossip. He understood that people didn't just want information. They wanted entertainment. Then came Poor Richard's Almanac. In the 18th century, almost every house had a Bible and an almanac. The almanac told you when to plant crops, when the tides changed, and what the weather might be. Franklin decided to spice his up. He created a persona, Richard Saunders, a henpecked husband who dispensed witty advice. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Fish and visitors stink in 3 days. It was a bestseller. Franklin was printing 10,000 copies a year. Money was pouring in. He franchised his printing business to other colonies, creating the first media chain in American history. But here is where Franklin separates himself from the likes of Rockefeller or Musk. He didn't just want to get rich. He wanted to be useful. He looked at Philadelphia and saw a mess. So he fixed it. The streets were dark. He organized a street sweeping service and designed better street lamps. Houses were burning down. He founded the Union Fire Company, the first volunteer fire department. People were uneducated. He founded the library company, the first subscription library. There was no defense against the French. He organized a militia. He was the first citizen of Philadelphia. By the age of 42, he was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies. And then he did something unthinkable. He retired. He sold his business interests. He moved to a quiet house. He wanted to devote the rest of his life to his true passion, science. Or, as they called it then, natural philosophy. Now, you have to understand, in the 1740s, electricity was a party trick. People used static generators to make sparks, shock their friends, or light alcohol on fire. It was magic. It was entertainment. Franklin looked at it and saw a force of nature. He turned his house into a lab. He invited friends over for electric parties where they would kill turkeys with electrical shocks. Franklin once accidentally shocked himself so hard he nearly passed out, describing it as a universal blow from head to toe. He started writing letters to the Royal Society in London about his findings. He coined the terms we still use today: battery, conductor, positive, negative, charge, and then he had the big idea, the dangerous idea. He suspected that lightning, that terrifying wrath of God that burned down churches and ships, was just static electricity on a massive scale. If he was right, it meant lightning wasn't a divine judgment. It was a natural phenomenon, and if it was natural, it could be controlled. He proposed an experiment: put a man in a sentry box on top of a high spire with a metal rod during a storm. If the rod drew sparks, lightning was electricity. Before he could do it himself, scientists in France tried it. It worked. They hailed Franklin as a genius, but Franklin wanted to be sure. This leads us to the most famous image in American history, the kite. June 1752, a thunderstorm is brewing over Philadelphia. Franklin and his 21-year-old son, William, run out to a shed in a field. They fly a silk kite with a wire tip into the clouds. The string is wet, rain-soaked hemp. At the bottom, a dry silk ribbon and a metal key. Franklin puts his knuckle near the key. Zap, a spark. He charges a Leyden jar, an early battery from the clouds. He had captured lightning. The news exploded. Immanuel Kant called him the Prometheus of modern times. The King of France sent him congratulations. The Royal Society gave him their highest medal. He was the most famous American in the world. He was the first American global celebrity. But notice who was with him in that shed: William, his son. This is the tragedy that haunts the Franklin story. William was illegitimate, born of a tryst before Franklin married Deborah. But Ben acknowledged him, raised him, and loved him. They were partners. They were best friends. When Ben went to London in 1757 to represent the colony of Pennsylvania, he took William with him. This brings us to the imperial years. We often think of the founding fathers as men who hated Britain from birth. Not Franklin. Franklin loved the empire. He saw the British Empire as the greatest force for civilization in history. He wanted the colonies to be full partners in that empire. In London, Franklin lived in style. He debated philosophy with David Hume. He stayed in country houses. He wore a wig. He navigated the corridors of power. He managed to get his son, William, appointed as the royal governor of New Jersey. Think about that. The runaway apprentice's son was now the king's representative. They had made it. But slowly, the dream began to rot. The 1760s brought the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Parliament began taxing the colonies to pay for the 7 Years' War. The mood in America turned ugly. Mobs were burning effigies. Franklin was stuck in the middle. In London, he tried to explain to the British that Americans were loyal subjects who just wanted their rights as Englishmen, no taxation without representation. In America, the radicals thought Franklin was a sellout, enjoying his posh life in London while they suffered. And honestly, he was a bit out of touch. He misjudged the anger back home. He actually recommended a friend for the job of stamp distributor, thinking it would be a good gig. When the mob in Philadelphia found out, they almost burned Franklin's house down. Deborah had to sit on the porch with a gun to protect their home. Franklin realized he had to pick a side. He began to see the corruption in the British government. He saw the arrogance. The British elite looked down on Americans as second-class citizens, as hicks, as convicts. Then came the Hutchinson letters. Franklin got his hands on some private letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts. In these letters, Hutchinson urged London to crack down on the Boston rebels, saying that an abridgment of what are called English liberties was necessary. Franklin was horrified. He thought the king was getting bad advice. He thought if he leaked these letters to the leaders in Boston, they would see that the governor was the problem, not the king. It would calm things down. He was wrong. So wrong. He sent the letters. They were published. Boston exploded in rage. The British government was furious. They wanted to know who leaked the letters. Men were dueling in Hyde Park over it. Franklin stepped forward. "I did it," he wrote. "I alone am the person." That brings us back to the cockpit. January 1774, Franklin stands there, taking the abuse. Wedderburn calls him a man of 3 letters. Fur, the Latin word for thief. When Franklin walked out of that room, the British Empire lost its greatest asset. He went home to his lodgings, took off that spotted velvet suit, and packed it away. He reportedly vowed never to wear it again until he signed the destruction of British power in America. He sailed for Philadelphia, but the tragedy was waiting for him. His son, William, the governor of New Jersey, remained loyal to the king. He couldn't understand his father's turn. He owed everything to the crown. They met at a friend's house to talk. It turned into a shouting match. The partnership was over. The father and son who had caught lightning together were now enemies in a civil war. They would barely speak for the rest of their lives. It broke Franklin's heart, but it didn't stop him. Franklin arrived in Philadelphia in May 1775. The battles of Lexington and Concord had already happened. The war was on. He was nearly 70. He should have been playing chess and bouncing grandchildren on his knee. Instead, he was thrown into the Continental Congress. He was the old man among the young wolves Jefferson, Adams, Washington. He helped edit the Declaration of Independence. When Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," Franklin the scientist, the secularist, picked up his quill and scratched it out. He wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, an axiom, a scientific fact." When they signed the document, the mood was grim. They were signing their own death warrants. Franklin, breaking the tension, allegedly quipped, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately. But declaring independence is one thing. Winning a war against the mightiest military on earth is another." Washington's army was ragged, starving, and outgunned. They needed money. They needed gunpowder. They needed a navy. They needed France. So, in late 1776, Congress played their trump card. They put Benjamin Franklin on a boat to Paris. This was a suicide mission. The Atlantic was swarming with British warships. If they caught him, he would be hanged as a traitor. He was old, suffering from gout and kidney stones. The crossing was brutal. But when he landed in France, something miraculous happened. To the French, Franklin wasn't just a politician. He was a superstar. He was the man who tamed lightning. He was the symbol of the Enlightenment. And Franklin, he played them like a fiddle. He knew what the French wanted. They wanted the natural man, the rustic philosopher from the woods of America. So he ditched the wig. He wore a fur cap. He wore simple brown clothes. He walked around Paris looking like a Quaker backwoodsman, and the French aristocracy went absolutely insane for it. Women started wearing Constitution wigs that looked like his fur cap. His face was painted on snuff boxes, rings, and chamber pots. He was the most fashionable thing in Paris. He set up shop in a suburb called Passy. He didn't go begging to the king at Versailles. He let them come to him. He hosted dinner parties. He flirted with the wives of powerful ministers. He wrote witty bagatelles. He created a social world that made the American cause fashionable. John Adams eventually arrived in Paris to help, and he hated it. Adams was stiff, puritanical, and straightforward. He was appalled by Franklin's lifestyle. He wrote that Franklin was lazy, disorganized, and too busy chasing women. But Adams missed the point. Franklin's laziness was a tactic. Franklin knew that you couldn't pressure a king. You had to seduce him. For a year, Franklin danced this diplomatic dance. He got secret shipments of arms. He kept the American army alive, but he needed an alliance. He needed France to declare war on Britain. Then came the news of the Battle of Saratoga. The Americans had captured a British army. Franklin seized the moment. He went to the French ministers and essentially said, "Look, we can win. But if you don't help us now, we might reconcile with Britain. Do you want that?" It worked. In 1778, France signed the Treaty of Alliance. It was the turning point of the war. Without French money and the French Navy, Yorktown never happens. American never happens. Franklin stayed in Paris for 8 years. He negotiated the peace treaty with Britain in 1783, and guess what he wore to the signing ceremony? That spotted Manchester velvet suit, the one he wore in the cockpit 9 years earlier. Revenge, as they say, is a dish best served in velvet. In 1785, Franklin finally went home. He was 79. He was in constant pain. His stone was so bad he couldn't ride in a carriage. The bumping was agony. The Queen of France lent him her personal litter, carried by mules, to get him to the coast. He arrived in Philadelphia hoping for rest. Instead, they made him president of the Executive Council of Pennsylvania, basically the governor. And then, in 1787, the Constitutional Convention. The states were falling apart. The Articles of Confederation weren't working. They needed a new government. 55 delegates gathered in the sweltering heat of the Pennsylvania State House. Franklin was the grandfather of the convention. He was too weak to stand and make speeches, so he had James Wilson read them for him, but his presence was the glue. Every time the convention threatened to blow up big states versus small states, North versus South, Franklin was there to calm the waters. He proposed the compromise on representation. He invited delegates to his house to drink under his mulberry tree and cool off. On the final day, as the delegates came forward to sign the Constitution, Franklin looked at the chair George Washington was sitting in. It had a sun carved into the back of it. Franklin whispered to a friend, "I have often ... in the course of the session looked at that sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know it is a rising and not a setting sun." He had one last fight in him. Throughout his life, Franklin's relationship with slavery was complicated. He had owned slaves in his younger years. He had run ads for slave auctions in his newspaper, but as he aged, his conscience shifted. He saw the hypocrisy of fighting for liberty while holding men in bondage. In 1790, less than 3 months before he died, Franklin signed his name to a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery. It was his last public act. He wrote a biting satire, mocking the pro-slavery arguments of a Georgia congressman by putting them in the mouth of a Muslim pirate, justifying the enslavement of Christians. Even on his deathbed, the man was trolling for justice. Congress ignored him. They tabled the petition. It would take another 75 years and a bloody civil war to answer Franklin's final request. Benjamin Franklin died on April 17, 1790, at the age of 84. 20,000 people attended his funeral. It was the largest gathering Philadelphia had ever seen. So, what are we to make of him? He is the only founding father who signed all 4 key documents of the founding: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris with Britain, and the Constitution. But he was more than a signature. Washington was the father of the country, stoic, distant, commanding. Jefferson was the visionary, poetic, idealistic, often hypocritical. But Franklin was us. He was the guy who started with nothing. The guy who hustled. The guy who cracked jokes. The guy who loved technology and innovation. The guy who realized that if you want a better society, you don't wait for a king to give it to you. You get your friends together, you form a club, and you build it yourself. He invented the American archetype, the self-made man, the civic-minded neighbor, the pragmatic problem solver. He wasn't perfect. He was a runaway who left his family. He was a father who let politics destroy his relationship with his son. He was a man of his time who took too long to see the evils of slavery. But in that cockpit in London, when he stood silent while the empire laughed at him, he taught us something essential. He taught us that there comes a moment when you have to stand up, no matter the odds, and decide who you are. And when he walked out, he didn't just step onto a London street. He stepped into the future, our future. Because before there was a United States of America, there was Benjamin Franklin. And in many ways, he is still the most modern American of them all.